So this week we're looking at the second part in Galatians, chapter 1, verses 11 to chapter 2, verse 10. Now what you need to understand tonight is that attacks on the gospel message and its messengers often have the benefit of clarifying the issues involved in the gospel. For example, Paul was attacked for not being a proper apostle and for not being a proper Jew. These attacks drove Paul to explain the source of his gospel message and of his commission to spread that message. What they also did was they pushed Paul to explain the relationship between being a Christian and being Jewish. Now, Paul did not insist that Gentiles be circumcised, nor did he insist that they follow Jewish rules about eating, rules that spelled out for them who they could eat with, when they could eat, how they had to wash their hands, how they had to prepare their food, and so on and so forth. All of this upset the false teachers. Remember the troublers? Who apparently claimed that what Paul did was different to what was the big-name apostles, Peter, James, and John, who were in Jerusalem, what they were doing. Now, Paul's response to this was twofold. Firstly, he said that he was not under the authority of the big-name apostles in Jerusalem. And by big name, I mean the big name that the false teachers were claiming. The gospel, said Paul, had come to him directly by revelation from God, chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. And hence, Paul was under God's authority, not the authority of the other apostles. Secondly, he said that what was preached was in full fellowship with the Jerusalem authorities. Although Paul was completely independent of the Jerusalem authorities, his message was the same as theirs. It was the one true gospel. Paul makes the point that before his conversion, he did not hear the gospel from any Christian preacher. Indeed, before his conversion, Paul's only contact with Christians was to persecute them. In fact, Paul did not hear the gospel from any human being, we're told. Then, says Paul, God himself revealed the gospel to me, and he did so in order that I might preach him, that is, Jesus, among the Gentiles. After his conversion, Paul went to Arabia. That much is certain. What is unclear is what happened while he was there. It is possible that he went off to preach the gospel without bothering to check if he had permission to do so, and he would have been perfectly in his right to do that. However, it's equally possible that during those 3 years he meditated on the Old Testament, on the facts of the life and death of Jesus, on the experience of his conversion. The gospel of the grace of God was revealed to him in its fullness. It's more likely that he went into Arabia for quiet solitude. This seems to be the point in verses 16 and 17, where he says, I did not confer with flesh and blood, but I went away into Arabia. Paul did eventually go to Jerusalem to talk to the bigwigs. The first time was 3 years after his conversion, and the second time was 14 years later. He went the second time because God told him to go, chapter 2, verse 2. Paul's concern was that he might run his race in vain. This most likely means that he was worried that those who thought Christians needed to be Jewish would ruin his work. It seems likely that by coming to Jerusalem to present his gospel message, Paul was not only verifying what he preached, but was also checking out the authenticity of the Jerusalem Christians. During Paul's visit to Jerusalem, he had with him an uncircumcised Christian called Titus. Paul resisted attempts to compel Titus to be circumcised. Why? So that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. This again was Paul drawing the line in the sand. The circumcision of Titus, he said, was a matter of the gospel itself. It was fundamental, not a side issue. So was Titus circumcised? The truth is that we actually don't know. All we know is that he was not compelled to be circumcised by the apostles in Jerusalem. However, if it would assist gospel ministry going forwards, it's quite possible that, like Timothy, he would be circumcised. But it's more likely that he wasn't. All that's really just a side note. The point is that there is a world of difference between being compelled to be circumcised or baptized or taking part in any religious ceremony as a legalistic requirement to be saved, and choosing freely to be circumcised or baptized or whatever it is in order to facilitate ministry. The issue of circumcision highlights the greatness of the gospel. Law-keeping is not the way to God. The way to God is through God's way to us, namely Jesus, who died for our forgiveness. The way to God is not by being good, but by being forgiven. It's not about religious ceremony or practice, but by coming to God through Jesus Christ. That is God's gospel, which of course we know is the only gospel there is.